Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a seriously volatile window in history, 1830 to 1848. This wasn't just, kings fighting other kings. This was the exact era when the modern concept of the nation-state was quite literally forged in the fires of popular rebellion. Let's see how a perfect storm of radical ideas and total economic ruin completely upended the old European conservative order.
So Austrian Chancellor Duke Metternich he was terrified of ideas crossing borders. And this quote, "When France sneezes, the rest of Europe catches cold." It just perfectly captures the sheer paranoia of the era's conservative powers. They knew that a single political uprising could spread like a highly contagious virus, totally threatening the absolutist monarchies that had ruled with an iron fist for centuries.
All right, part one, the 1830 spark, igniting the chain reaction.
To really understand this era, we have to look at two completely opposing forces. On one side, you've got heavily entrenched conservative regimes fighting tooth and nail to maintain absolute, unquestioned power. And on the flip side, a rising tide of liberal nationalists. Now, these weren't seasoned military generals. We're talking about the educated middle-class elite, professors, school teachers, commercial clerks, everyday professionals who boldly weaponized liberalism and nationalism against the establishment.
It all kicked off in France in July 1830. The Bourbon kings, who, by the way, had just been restored to power about 15 years prior, were suddenly overthrown by these liberal revolutionaries, who installed a constitutional monarchy. Basically, France sneezed, and the fever instantly spread. That exact same July Revolution sparked an uprising in Brussels, which led to Belgium breaking away from the United Kingdom of the Netherlands. Right around the same time, the Greek War of Independence culminated in the 1832 Treaty of Constantinople, officially recognizing Greece as a fully independent nation. The dominoes were literally falling.
And this fight for independence mobilized educated elites all across the continent. Take the famous English poet Lord Byron, for example. He didn't just sit around in a parlor writing romantic verses about freedom. No, he actually used his own personal fortune to equip an army and went off to fight in the Greek War of Independence. Even though he tragically died of a fever in 1824, his actions showed just how deeply these radical ideals possessed the intellectuals of the time.
Moving right along to part two, the cultural fuel, Romanticism and the nation.
You see, nationalism didn't just spread at the end of a bayonet. It was driven intensely by Romanticism. Romantic artists and poets explicitly rejected the cold, mechanical calculations of science. Instead, they focused on raw emotion, intuition, and mystical feelings. Their main goal was to engineer a shared collective heritage. Because they realized that to build a successful nation, you first had to construct a common cultural glue to bind everyone together.
So things like poetry, folk stories, and music, they weren't just evening entertainment anymore. They were actively weaponized to build national identity. Language itself actually became a vital tool of fierce resistance. For instance, when Poland was partitioned and taken over by Russia, the Russian language was brutally forced on the population. In response, the Polish people stubbornly used their own native language in church gatherings and religious instruction. It was a direct symbol of struggle, and the stakes were incredibly high. Priests and bishops were frequently thrown in jail or even exiled to the freezing wastes of Siberia simply for daring to preach in Polish.
Which brings us to part three, the powder keg. Hunger, hardship, and popular revolt.
Now, while the elites were busy debating poetry and language, the reality on the streets was an absolute nightmare. A massive population boom across Europe meant there were just way too many people chasing way too few jobs. Desperate rural workers were flooding into incredibly overcrowded, disease-ridden city slums. At the exact same time, local artisans were getting completely crushed by cheap, machine-made goods pouring out of newly industrialized England. Meanwhile, peasants out in the countryside were still choking under the weight of old feudal dues. Add in a devastating year of failed harvests and skyrocketing food prices, and you don't just have an economic downturn, you have widespread pauperism and mass starvation.
This brings us to a terrifying turning point for the ruling class. Think about it. What exactly happens when a highly organized intellectual movement armed with romantic ideals of freedom collides head-on with a desperate, starving populace that has absolutely nothing left to lose?
Let's find out in part 4, the explosion. The revolutions of 1848.
Well, the pressure finally blew in Paris. Driven by sheer hunger and massive unemployment, the masses barricaded the streets, and it actually forced King Louis Philippe to run for his life. Out of all that chaos, a brand new republic was proclaimed. And just look at how utterly radical their solutions were for the time. They instantly granted universal suffrage to all adult males, and they even tried to guarantee the right to work by setting up national workshops. In 1848, ideas like that were absolutely earth-shattering.
Once again, France sneezed, and Europe caught the fever. The liberal middle classes across Germany, Italy, Poland, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire saw their opening and took it. Men and women combined their demands for constitutionalism with a fierce push for national unification. They started demanding things that, honestly, we largely take for granted today. Things like formal constitutions, parliamentary nation-states, freedom of the press, and the right to freely associate and organize.
You can really see the sheer utopian ambition of 1848 through the eyes of French artist Frédéric Sérieux. Notice the foreground here. Shattered crowns and royal symbols just lying discarded in the dirt. It represents the permanent destruction of absolute monarchy. And then, past that debris, there's this long, endless train of people from Europe and America marching together, grouped as distinct democratic nations with their own unique flags. This was the ultimate idealized dream of the 1848 revolutions.
Finally, Part 5, the aftermath, repression and concessions. Ultimately, conservative military forces did manage to suppress the liberal movements, and the old order restored its grip on power. But here is the great irony. The autocrats quickly realized they couldn't simply turn the clock back. No way. They understood that to survive and to stop these endless cycles of revolution, they actually had to enact major liberal policies themselves. In the years following 1848, serfdom and bonded labor were completely abolished in both the Habsburg dominions and in Russia. And by 1867, the absolute Habsburg rulers were even forced to grant political autonomy to the Hungarians.
So, I want to leave you with this final thought to ponder as we wrap up this explainer. We so often hear that the revolutions of 1848 were crushed. But if these so-called failed rebellions managed to permanently abolish serfdom, terrify absolute monarchs into giving up their grip on power, and forge the modern concept of the independent nation-state, can we really call them a failure? Just how powerful is an idea once it takes hold? It's a striking reminder that sometimes the true impact of a revolution isn't seen on the day the barricades fall, but in the decades of transformation that follow.